Hello. I'm so glad so many of you came out tonight because I was just telling Chris it's just a sign of how popular he's become. He's been with us several times. Chris Hallett, professor of art history and ancient art in particular at Berkeley. But I think just in general, the series has become more and more well attended, which I'm just so glad to see, and I'm glad to see such a variety of people coming out. We do have a lot of new speakers lined up, and we'll be very happy to share that with you as soon as we get people's dates buttoned up. But the next lecture is set, and that is Jan Tiki, who is an artist. He works out of many places, but he teaches at the Art Institute, the School of Fine Arts in Chicago. And he'll be talking about Lucia Moholy, who's sort of the forgotten Moholy. You know Moholy-Nagy, right? But the wife of Moholy, who was a practicing artist. And he's done a huge amount of research to recollect her art and actually recreate, in facsimile form, some of her projects, and which are also light-based and highly experimental. So please do make an effort to come and see him speak as well. And you can always check our website. We do post the lectures online, so if you miss any, you can visit our website and find them in our video library. But let me just make a few remarks about Chris. He is professor of the history of art and classics at UC Berkeley since, we won't say since when, for a long time. He got his academic training at University of Bristol, Lincoln College, Oxford, and at Berkeley. He's a specialist of Roman sculpture and the author of The Roman Nude Heroic Portrait Statuary, which was published a long time ago. And he's, as I say, one of our favorite speakers. He's been with us several times now. More recently, he gave a lecture on our so-called mummy portrait. Maybe you saw that lecture. And you can find, again, all these lectures online if you missed them. Chris is also a very active field archaeologist, and he's been working on NYU's excavations in Aphrodisias in southwestern Turkey, and he continues to make incredible finds there. Today's lecture is on the building projects of Julius Caesar in the late 50s and early 40s BC, and I'm sure is based on the new findings he's made in his position as a consultant for the Danish-Italian excavations in the Forum of Caesar. So as always, it's a great privilege to welcome him to the stage. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ike, for that very warm introduction. I must say, it's very nice to be back here in Santa Barbara, so thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very glad you keep inviting me back. I'd like to begin today by saying something about how I come to be working on Julius Caesar and his various building projects in the city of Rome. And this means I must tell you something about the Caesar's Forum project, and this is the Danish-Italian excavations that I just mentioned that have been in progress now in one way or another since 2017. The project involves uncovering the large part of the Forum that has never been excavated, most of it still covered by the Via dei Fori Imperiali, built by Mussolini. But it also involves publishing the results of a series of earlier Italian excavations on the site, which took place in the early 2000s. It represents a collaboration between Aarhus University in Denmark, the Danish Institute in Rome, and the Sovrintendenza Capitolina ai Beni Culturali. The project is overseen by 3 co-directors, Rubina Raja, Jan Kindberg, and Claudio Parisi Presice. And it's funded by the Carlsberg Foundation and by a flagship grant of the Aarhus University Research Foundation. And as a consultant on this project, I I want to make sure that I explain who is actually responsible for all of this and where the authority and the money is coming from for this big project. In 2019, I participated in a conference on Julius Caesar held at the Royal Danish Academy, organized by Rubina Raja, in connection with this new Caesar's Forum project, which had just started. I then had the good fortune to spend the academic year 2020-2021 at Aarhus University, working on a short monograph with her, a kind of programmatic statement for the project, which examines what modern scholars believe is known about Caesar's Forum and sets out why the site matters for our broader understanding of the development of the city of Rome under the early empire. Now, hearing now that there are new excavations going on in Rome, many of you may be eager for an account of what has been found so far by the Danish and Italian archaeologists. But for the moment, I'm afraid you're going to have to wait to hear about that. I should point out, however, an article appeared a few months ago in the May issue of the magazine World Archaeology, shown here on the right, which was titled Digging Caesar's Forum. It presents an interesting summary of what has been learned so far, or some aspects of what they've found so far. But that's not what I'm here to talk about today. Instead, what I'm going to do is to give you a sample of the kind of rethinking about Caesar and about his various building projects that this new investigation of Caesar's Forum has prompted. And I'm going to begin with the theme that forms the first part of my title. So that is Julius Caesar as second founder of Rome. Ancient writers who comment on Julius Caesar's building projects universally acknowledge their remarkable scale and ambition. Cicero was one of those deputized by Caesar to negotiate buying the land for the extension of the Roman Forum that he was planning. In writing to his friend Atticus in 54 BC, Cicero reports that they expended 60 million sesterces on this purchase. This, of course, does not include any of the costs of the buildings that Caesar was later to construct there. The historian Pliny the Elder and the imperial biographer Suetonius, both writing more than a century afterwards, say the land actually cost more. They give the figure as 100 million sesterces. Perhaps Caesar went on to purchase additional land after 54 BC. To gain some perspective on this expenditure, it has been calculated that 100 million sesterces would keep a very large Roman army of 15 legions in the field for a whole year. Cicero, in the passage of his letter excerpted in this slide, also describes Caesar's plans for the Saepta in the Campus Martius, the Field of Mars. This was a building to replace the old Ovile, as it was called, the place in Rome where the Comitia Tributa, the tribal assembly, was held. The plans included marble voting booths in a building which was to be enclosed within a grand colonnade a mile long. Pliny the Elder further credits Caesar with large improvements to the Circus Maximus, the great chariot racing arena, that were also made during these very years. And various other authors, including Aulus Gellius, report that Caesar extended the Pomerium, the religious heart of the city, just as the dictator Sulla had done before him. A further letter of Cicero reports a law that Caesar promulgated 9 years later, in 45 BC, after his final victory in the civil war that he fought against Pompey the Great. This was the Lex de Urbe Augenda, for enlarging the city. Cicero recounts that Ateius Capito, one of Caesar's inner circle, gave him and the great polymath Marcus Varro an account of the substance of this law. Capito explained that the Tiber is being diverted at the Mulvian Bridge to run alongside the Vatican Hills. The Campus Martius is being built over, and the other campus, the Vaticanus, is becoming a new Campus Martius. So the plans included a new field of Mars. All this amounts to a building program of unprecedented ambition within Rome itself. No Roman leader had ever attempted refashioning the city on this scale. And it's within the larger framework of these grand plans that we should understand Pliny the Elder's remark in Book 36 of his Natural History, where he compares Caesar's Forum to the pyramids of the pharaohs, Pyramidas Regum. Julius Caesar is not usually remembered or spoken of as Rome's second founder, either by ancient writers or by modern scholars. But it has been proposed that some of the honors voted him by the Senate and the populus Romanus, the Roman people, in the last 2 years of his life, properly understood, amount to an implicit award of this title. And the idea that his supporters were seriously celebrating him as a new Romulus provides a useful starting point for my presentation today, for it furnishes us with a way of thinking about the impact of Caesar's buildings in the period just before his assassination in 44 BC. So what is the evidence for Caesar being honored as a new Romulus and a second founder of the city? In 45 BC, news arrived that a great battle had been fought at Munda in Spain, and Caesar had been victorious. The news reached Rome on the day before the Perilia, the festival which celebrated the birthday of Rome, Romulus's founding of the city. As a result, it was voted by the Roman people that henceforth games celebrating Caesar's victory should be held in the Circus Maximus as part of the annual festival of the Perilia. At the same time, it was decreed that an ivory statue of Caesar should now be carried in the procession that preceded the games, among the images of all the gods. Such processional statues, made of light materials such as wood or ivory, were regularly carried in religious processions at Rome on furcula, the kind of stretchers or floats, such as the one seen in the terracotta plaque that's shown here on the right. Another honor that was voted Caesar at this time was that a portrait statue of him was to be dedicated in the Temple of Quirinus in Rome. Quirinus being the name that the Romans used for the deified Romulus. How striking these honors for Caesar were, and what a sensation they caused at the time, may be judged from another of Cicero's letters to Atticus, written a few months later. In his letter, Cicero sarcastically refers to Caesar as this figure from the procession, hunc de pompa, and this fellow lodger of Quirinus. A contubernalis is a term for a fellow soldier who on campaign shares the same tent. I give Cicero's Latin there at the very bottom of this slide. What did these portrait statues of Caesar look like? Here we have little to go on, for almost nothing is known about these images, either the ivory figure carried in the procession at the Perilia, or the portrait statue that stood in the Temple of Romulus Quirinus. But there is some evidence for statues of Caesar that were set up later, after his death. Following the appearance of a great comet several months after Caesar's assassination, we know that Caesar's great-nephew, whom he had adopted in his will, this is the 19-year-old Gaius Octavius, later Emperor Augustus, whom scholars refer to at this point in his career as Octavian. We know that Octavian then had placed a representation of this comet, or Caesar's star, as it was called, the Sidus Iulium, on the head of a portrait of Caesar that was soon afterwards set up in the Roman Forum. Octavian himself tells us this in his own words in a passage from his autobiography excerpted and quoted by Pliny the Elder. And I've included Octavian's words quoted by Pliny in this slide. Moreover, the young Octavian's actions at that time, adorning statues of Caesar with images of the comet, seems to be commemorated and symbolically represented on a coin minted about 30 years later in 12 BC by the Flamen Martialis, the priest of Mars, Lucius Lentulus. This coin plainly shows a statue of Julius Caesar being crowned with a star, and it is a statue of him in heroic costume. That is, Caesar is shown nude, wearing only a military cloak drawn around his hips, carrying a spear in his left hand and grasping in his right a tiny figure of the goddess Victory, alighting on a globe. The question is this representation on later coins reliable evidence for how Caesar was portrayed in Rome in 45 BC, when he was voted the ivory statue that was carried in procession in the Circus Maximus? Is this how we should imagine, for example, the statue that stood in the temple of Romulus Quirinus on the Quirinal Hill? That is certainly not impossible. Portrait statues of leading Romans shown in this costume were definitely being set up in Italy at this time, and even earlier. The Tivoli General, for example, seen here on the left of this slide, dates to around the time of Caesar's birth, around 100 BC. So without any question, Caesar could have been shown in this way. But none of the surviving portrait statues of this period that wear this particular costume is known to have been found in Rome. What is regarded as certain is that the statue on Lentulus's coin shows how Caesar was most often represented after his assassination, that is, as Divus Julius, after Octavian and his other supporters had had him deified, made a god. In the Augustan period, statues of Julius Caesar stood in Caesar's Forum, in the Temple of Venus Genotrix, in the great Pantheon built by Marcus Agrippa in the Campus Martius, and in the Temple of Divus Julius that Augustus built in the Roman Forum. And I'm showing here a reconstruction drawing of that temple with its cult image visible through the open doors on the left there. And in all of these cases, scholars tend to assume that it was in this costume that Caesar was being represented in this early period of Augustus's rule. The coin images are by no means the only representations we possess of statues of Divus Julius. There are a number of such depictions. Here we see the Ravenna relief, on which is represented a group of statues honoring members of the imperial family. The Emperor Augustus is seen on the far right, and moving from right to left, we see Augustus's wife Livia Drusilla, then next to her, Divus Julius, and then Marcus Agrippa, shown wearing Augustan parade armor. The deified Julius Caesar is here depicted as a young man. He would certainly not be recognizable to us as a portrait of Julius Caesar, but for the Cedus Iulium carved in relief on his forehead and once probably gilded, picked out in gold, so that it would have been very visible. Other similarly rejuvenated images of the deified Caesar appear later on Augustan coins, rendered identifiable only by the addition of the star or comet set above the forehead. Thus, there's considerable agreement among scholars about the appearance of Caesar's statues after he was deified. Michael Court-Bogen, however, in his book The Divination of Caesar and Augustus, published in 2013, advances a different proposal for the appearance of Julius Caesar's statue in the Temple of Romulus Quirinus at Rome, set up, you will recall, while he was still alive in 45 BC. In 36 BC, 8 years after Caesar's assassination and 6 years after his official deification, the planned Temple of Divus Julius, the deified Julius, appeared on an issue of silver coins, denarii, minted by Octavian. On the coin, the cult statue of Caesar is visible between the columns of the temple's facade, and he's shown wearing a toga, capite velato, that is, with his head veiled. In addition, he holds in his right hand a large lituus, the curling staff of a Roman augur, the priest who interpreted bird omens. Corbogin argues that when this coin was minted, the cult statue for the temple had not yet been created. In fact, the temple was not completed and dedicated by Octavian until 29 BC, some 7 years later. So for the cult image on the coin, Octavian's mint master used the statue of Caesar that had been set up in the temple of Romulus Quirinus 9 years earlier, in 45 BC. Corbogin's careful account of the different pieces of literary and archaeological evidence that can be brought to bear on this coin is actually quite complex, but I'm going to present the argument here quite quickly and simply. The decision to place a portrait statue of Caesar in the temple of Romulus Quirinus in 45 BC was made in order to honor him as second founder of Rome. The city had been founded, so legend had it, by an act of augury, that is, by an observation of the flight of birds. Romulus took up a position on the Palatine, his chosen site for the new city, in order to watch for bird omens, and was granted by Jupiter the omen of witnessing the flight of 12 vultures. This famous augury, the Augurium Augustum, as the Roman poet Ennius called it, resulted in the founding of Rome. The Romans even believed that Romulus's lituus, the curling wooden augural staff which he used, was preserved at Rome, still intact. The relic had miraculously survived the sack of Rome by the Gauls, and we know that it was kept by the Salii, a college of priests, in their headquarters on the Palatine Hill. Accordingly, the statue that showed Julius Caesar with head veiled and holding a large lituus showed him taking an augury, so Michael Corbogin suggests. And this statue was first created to stand in Romulus Quirinus' temple, explicitly to show Caesar as a second Romulus. Corbogin's claim that the statue of Caesar with head veiled must go back to the period before his death actually receives strong support from a series of coins minted in Rome in 44 BC, in the period directly before he was assassinated, though Corbogin does not refer to these coins in making his argument. These silver denarii confirm that a fine and highly detailed portrait type of Caesar with veiled head was created at this time, while Caesar was still living. Corbogin's proposal that this was the statue set up in the Temple of Quirinus is an attractive one. Thus, the statue of Caesar, shown on Octavian's coin of 36 BC, may be taken, for our purposes, as the perfect expression of a decision by the Roman people to honor him as another Romulus and the second founder of their city. Of course, if Corbogin is correct, then this means that the use of the lituus in honorific portraiture at Rome after 45 BC also has a somewhat different significance, one that has been missed up to now. When Mark Antony, immediately after Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, has himself depicted wearing a beard of mourning, with his head veiled and with a lituus set beside him, he's not just showing himself as an augur, there is potentially a much stronger resonance. He's unmistakably representing himself as Caesar's successor, carrying out his plans of refounding the city. And when the bronze equestrian portrait of Caesar's adopted son, Octavian, set up on the rostra in the Forum, is also represented on coins, holding an oversized lituus in his hand, even though Octavian is not wearing a toga and doesn't have his head veiled in the way that someone officiating at at a religious ceremony does in Roman art. So even though he's not got those other aspects of the costume, this may also be taken as a reference to the earlier statue of Caesar. We know, for example, that when Octavian was elected consul in 43 BC, the year after Caesar was assassinated, and he took the auspices as augur, he was reported, like Romulus, to have been granted the omen of a flight of 12 vultures. The historian of Roman religion, John Scheid, has even suggested that this omen was perhaps staged by Octavian, who must have deliberately had vultures released. In any case, if Court-Bogen is right, and all these are taken as references to this earlier statue of Caesar set up in the Temple of Quirinus, then Antony and Octavian in these images are surely representing themselves as engaged in this refounding of the city that was commemorated by this image. Notably, when Octavian has sealed his position as first emperor Augustus, as you see him here on the Gemma Augustea, when he's later shown holding a lituus in his hand, and he's certainly not engaged in augury, the augural staff potentially becomes a clear and pointed reference to his new name, Augustus, which now explicitly identifies him as the refounder of Romulus's Rome. Romulus's Rome, remember, was founded under the favorable omen of the Augurium Augustum. That's where the title or name Augustus actually comes from. Finally, the most startling possibility. If the image on the coin on the far left of this particular slide represents Gaius Julius Caesar as the new Romulus in a statue set up in the Temple of Quirinus in 45 BC, then put a lituus in the slightly raised right hand of all the portraits of Augustus shown with veiled head, like this marble statue shown here on the right. And here we have not Augustus officiating as a priest, as the many Roman art textbooks have labeled these statues, but the first emperor succeeding to his adoptive father's most ambitious role, second founder of the city of Rome. I now come to the second part of today's presentation. Caesar's plans for Rome and Caesar's Forum, a thought experiment. Because Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, with most of his building projects left unfinished, and with some of them not even started, his impact on the city of Rome and the nature of the interventions he made in the urban plan are today disputed. Yet the new joint Danish-Italian excavations offer a quite exceptional opportunity for scholars to reconsider the question of Caesar's original intentions and to undertake a comprehensive re-evaluation of his legacy as a builder. It's with this in mind that the second part of this lecture, in the second part of this lecture, I want to offer a thought experiment, which I hope will suggest something of the promise of this current project. When confronting the archaeological evidence for Caesar's Forum, there's a wide range of possible starting points, all of which we may regard as falling between two extremes or poles. All the architecture that survives from the site today is of the late 1st and early 2nd century AD or later. This is because the whole complex, including the temple of Venus Genotrix, was burned down in the reign of the Emperor Domitian, so towards the end of the 1st century AD. The Forum was then rebuilt, beginning under Domitian, but it was finished and rededicated by the Emperor Trajan in the early years of the 2nd century AD. Parts of the outer colonnades surrounding the Forum were then later reconstructed and replaced in the Tetrarchic period, that is, at the very end of the 3rd century AD. So, disappointingly, virtually nothing of the surviving architecture seems to date from the original buildings of the period of Julius Caesar and Augustus. Nevertheless, as far as can be told, the later emperors who rebuilt the complex reconstructed it just as it had been in 29 BC when it was completed by Augustus. That is, they seem to have followed the early Augustan design very closely, only using finer and more expensive materials, and perhaps elaborating and updating some of the features of the architecture. We are then left with an important question. How closely did the complex as completed by Augustus adhere to Caesar's original plan? Conceived, let's face it, some 25 years earlier in 54 BC. On the one hand, we may hypothesize that what was eventually constructed after Caesar's assassination was essentially what he'd always intended. This is the position taken by scholars such as Paul Zanker in his authoritative account of the Forum Romanum, and implicitly by the architectural historian Lothar Hasselberger, who entirely omits Caesar's Forum from his influential book on the Augustan building program, Urbem Adonare, Rome's urban metamorphosis under Augustus. Or we may propose the opposite hypothesis, that what was eventually built and rededicated in 29 BC by Augustus was something that only gradually emerged, the final outcome being more the result of decisions by Augustus and his advisors rather than by Julius Caesar. This is closer to the position of the American scholar Roger Ulrichs, among others. Working in the late 1980s and early 1990s, Ulrich produced a series of very detailed studies of the foundations of the Forum, and particularly of the Temple of Venus Genotrix. Of course, many scholars who today write about the Forum start from somewhere between these two extremes. But the question I wish to consider in this second section of today's lecture is what is at stake in assuming one or other of these opposed and contradictory starting points? What changes in our understanding of the Forum itself, or in our estimate of Caesar as a builder and politician, if we take one or other of these two positions? So we'll begin with hypothesis one. The Forum as we have it is what Caesar always intended. What are the consequences of making this assumption? First, we take for granted that Caesar had always aimed to make the centerpiece of his building project a temple, and that temple was to house the divine originator of his own family, the goddess Venus Genotrix. Her title or epithet here, Genotrix, means something like ancestral mother. Colonnades closed the whole area off from the Roman Forum, and the whole open plaza was thus designed as a self-contained urban unit, constructed in the finest available materials, following the most up-to-date Hellenistic models. Viewed in this way, Caesar's Forum becomes first of all a large, but rather traditional, manubial temple, that is, a temple built by a victorious Roman general from the spoils or profits, the manubiae, resulting from his victory. It is also instantly recognizable as the first of the great sequence of imperial fora, if we take this position. That is, the series of large self-contained spaces built by later emperors that gradually expanded Rome's symbolic monumental center to several times its original size. If we take this position, by implication, Julius Caesar becomes the first emperor of Rome, followed by Augustus, Vespasian, Domitian, and Trajan, who all construct new forums of their own, directly emulating his, and taking his original design as their prototype. Now we move to hypothesis two. Caesar's Forum, as we have it, is the product of a long sequence of unforeseen changes of plan. This diametrically opposed position also has its advocates, and the arguments on this side can also be quickly summarized. When we first learn of Caesar's plans in the letter of Cicero, written in 54 BC that we looked at earlier, there's quite plainly no thought of the new construction constituting a separate forum of the sort we see in the drawing here on the right. In the account that Cicero gives of the purchase of land, the aim is to widen the existing Roman Forum at its northwest corner and to extend it as far as the Atrium Libertatis, the Hall of Liberty, usually assumed to be situated somewhere behind and to the north of the Curia, the Roman Senate house. At that time, it was the Curia Hostilia, built by Sulla. We're also given a pretty significant clue as to the purpose of this extension. For the area of the Forum that Caesar is extending is quite explicitly that of the Comitium, the old place of assembly for the Populus Romanus, where the citizenry of Rome would gather close to the Senate House to be addressed by their leaders in both formal and informal political gatherings, or contiones. We may thus characterize this interpretation of Caesar's plan as Caesar aimed to build a new, larger comitium, or assembly space for the Roman people. Ancient sources inform us that the old comitium had by this time long been too small and too cramped to be used when the tribunes of the plebs addressed the popular assembly. This is particularly well brought out in this plan of the northwest end of the Forum. Here we see the same area as in the last plan, but now inverted with the south at the top. You can see the degree to which buildings had progressively encroached on and narrowed the available space for gatherings of the people. In Cicero's letter, the project of extending the Forum in the area of the Comitium is coupled with a new monumentalization of the Saepta in the Campus Martius, the voting area for the tribal assembly, the Comitia Tributa. We hear of marble voting booths, now to be enclosed in an enormous stone porticus. Both of these projects, then, are what we might expect from Caesar, the most successful popularist politician of his generation, promoting the cause of ordinary Roman citizens against the narrower special interests of the Roman senatorial elite, and championing their role in the government of the Roman state. For both of these measures aim to give an imposing, monumental form to the participation in political power of the Populus Romanus, in its places of assembly and voting. Note, in Cicero's letter, there was no mention of a temple. The period we're talking about between 54 BC and 44 BC is, relatively speaking, one of the best documented periods in all of Roman history. We have the writings of Caesar himself, all his commentaries from his time in Gaul, and the continuation of these commentaries by his lieutenants, extending down right through the period of the civil wars. We also have Cicero's letters, and we have the writings of later historians who were able to draw on a whole array of contemporary sources now lost to us. There is no mention in any of them that Caesar intended to build a temple to Venus to commemorate his conquest in Gaul. In fact, the vow of a temple only comes in 48 BC, 6 years after the acquisition of the land by Cicero and Oppius, and immediately before the Battle of Pharsalus. At that time, we're told, Caesar vowed a temple to Venus Victrix, the patron goddess of Pompey, his opponent in the civil war, if he should be successful in the coming battle against Pompey's forces. And Venus Victrix subsequently appears on Caesar's coins, proffering a small image of victory in her extended right hand. Seen then from the perspective of Cicero's letter, the decision to insert a temple into the space that Caesar had been preparing to serve as an expanded new comitium looks very much like a major and unforeseen change of plan, brought on by the wholly unforeseen civil war that had to be fought against Pompey. The very design of the temple that Caesar erected has been regarded by some as confirming this. For the temple that Caesar built, faithfully reconstructed in the later rebuilding by Domitian, is what Roger Ulrich has dubbed a templum rostratum, a temple that is fronted not by a flight of steps, as is usual in Roman architecture, but by a speaker's platform, or rostrum. One could only ever enter this temple from the sides by means of two lateral staircases leading up to the speaker's platform. These are indicated by the red arrows in the plan of the building that I'm showing here. Previously, there had been only one temple in Rome with this design, the Temple of Castor and Pollux in the Roman Forum, more often spoken of as the Temple of Castor. This temple had, in the mid-2nd century BC, served as a speaker's platform, since it stood in the Forum and was conveniently situated for popular meetings. And towards the end of the 2nd century BC, the front of the temple was given the form that you see in this slide. In fact, once the Comitium was diminished in size by various encroaching buildings, and it became too small to be functional, especially after the rebuilding of the Senate House by the dictator Sulla, the Temple of Castor, which we see here, became a regular venue for holding meetings of the popular assembly. Meetings of the Senate were also held inside the temple. When Julius Caesar was consul in 59 BC, it was here that he convened the Roman people. Much of Caesar's legislation was passed by popular vote, with him presiding from the speaker's platform on the front of this temple, the Temple of Castor. That Caesar decided that his new temple to Venus Genotrix should be fronted by a speaker's platform may be viewed as good evidence that the extension to the Roman Forum he was building was intended as an expanded comitium, where assemblies of the people could be held. And the expensive extension of the temple's cella, its cult room, far back into the hillside. So there's a steep slope here, and they've had to actually cut into the hill. You can see they've done it in stages in order to actually get a large enough temple at this end. They're clearly wanting to have a very, very long, extensive space in front of it. This too, the need for such an enormous space in front of the temple also seems to align with this particular reading of the evidence. Not everyone agrees with this line of interpretation, however. Fulker Michael Strocker, for example, considers that the platform at the front of the temple, as it was built, was always too shallow to have served for speakers at popular assemblies. Moreover, the temple as it was completed by Augustus in 29 BC and reconstructed by Domitian eventually had fountains and bases for statues placed in front of the speaker's platform. As you can see clearly, these are clearly indicated in these reconstruction plan and reconstruction drawings. These water features and marble figures of freshwater nymphs, the Apiades, are several times mentioned by Augustan writers. For Strocker, these fountains and statues may be regarded as clinching evidence that the front of the Temple of Venus can never have been intended as a rostrum for speakers to address contiones, or gatherings of the people. He writes, and actually I've got this quote, he writes, "The apparently inaccessible podium on which the temple is raised has, in my judgment, nothing to do with a speaker's platform, but is an aesthetic means to make clear the symbolic importance of the forum complex." Others, however, would argue that Strocker's claim runs directly counter to what we read in the writings of some of the other ancient sources, in particular the later Greek historian Appian. For Appian informs us, in absolutely explicit terms, that Caesar's Temple of Venus was not set in an enclosed sanctuary, as was, for example, the Temple of Apollo on the Palatine, but in a precinct that was designated as an agora, or forum for the Roman people, for the coming together to transact public business. That sounds very much as if Caesar specified that the area was intended for court cases or for popular assemblies, that in earlier days had been held in the Comitium, or in front of the Temple of Castor. Much is made of the temple that Caesar built being devoted to the cult of Venus Genotrix, the ancestral mother of Caesar's family, almost as if he'd titled the goddess Venus Julia, the Julian Venus. For many scholars, the cult title alone makes the whole complex look more like a personal monument to Caesar himself, rather than an attempt to create a new enlarged comitium for the popular assembly. Yet before Caesar ever began building the temple, the title Genotrix was an epithet already in use at Rome for the goddess Venus. Venus Genotrix was actually the ancestral mother through Aeneas, not just of Caesar and the Julian family, but of all Romans. This is well known, but perhaps bears repeating. Each of the commanders who fought wars in the Greek East, from Titus Quinctius Flamininus onwards, Sulla, Memmius, Lucullus, Pompey, and Caesar, were all greeted by the Greeks as sons of Aeneas, Aeneadae. We know this from many sources. I'll just quote a small selection here. First, 2 inscriptions set up by Flamininus at Delphi at the beginning of the 2nd century BC, and recorded for us by Plutarch. In one, Flamininus refers to himself as a son of Aeneas, and in the other as the great leader of the sons of Aeneas. Next, a Greek oracle that was reportedly received by Lucius Sulla more than a century later, probably when he first arrived in Greece in order to conduct the war against King Mithridates. The oracle refers to the Romans as the race of Aeneas, the genos of Aeneas. The legendary origin of Rome, which gives rise to this usage among the Greeks, is related to us by the Roman historian Sallust, writing in the late 40s BC. In recounting the beginnings of the Roman people, he makes no mention of Romulus, but writes instead, "The city of Rome, as I have learned, was at the outset founded and inhabited by Trojans, who with Aeneas as their leader were wandering in exile without any fixed abodes." The Greek biographer Plutarch, in his Life of Romulus, also quotes several versions of the founding of Rome, which makes Romulus simply a son of Aeneas. The word Aeneadae even gets into Latin as a word for Romans. It's found in Virgil's Aeneid, used in this way, in Ovid's Metamorphoses as well, and it continues in use in both Latin and Greek under the Empire. The epic poet Silius Italicus, in his Punica, refers to Scipio Africanus as a son of Aeneas, and later the Roman Emperor Hadrian wrote a poem wrote a poem in Greek celebrating a dedication to Zeus made by his older relative, the Emperor Trajan, in Antioch in Syria, when the emperor was on his way to fight the Persians. In this poem, he refers to Trajan as a son or descendant of Aeneas. But the most important precedent for the cult title of Venus as she's found in Caesar's Forum is represented by the opening words of Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, published in the mid-50s BC. Writing in the 2nd century BC, Ennius had in his Annales referred to Venus as Genotrix, in this instance meaning only the mother of Aeneas. That's the passage quoted here on the left. Lucretius, writing a decade or more before the dedication of Caesar's temple, took this stately Ennian coinage and applied it to Venus's relationship to the Roman people as a whole. And this is the passage you see excerpted here on the right. In the very first line of his epic, he invokes Venus as partner in creating his poem and calls her Genotrix of the Aeneadae, divine ancestral mother of the Roman people. Accordingly, the choice of the cult title Venus Genotrix, properly understood, is not a narrow personal claim being made by Caesar about his own lineage, for Venus was always the ancestral mother of the entire populus Romanus. This cult title is arguably much better fitted for a new space intended to serve as a place of popular assembly than Pompey's Venus Victrix would have been, which, like all the other manubial temples of Rome, would place the emphasis on a particular moment and the personal victory of a single commander. There are further indications of the political importance of Caesar's decision to put a speaker's platform on the front of his new temple to Venus Genotrix. For 3 of the most important new temples dedicated in the first phase of the Augustan building program in the 20s BC all share this distinctive form. and I've got them laid out in plan, at least here. The Temple of Dius Julius, built by Augustus in the center of the Roman Forum, on the spot where Caesar's body had been cremated. Next to the right is Agrippa's Pantheon, built on the field of Mars, the Campus Martius. And the one furthest to the right, the Temple of Apollo Socianus, built in the area of the Circus Flaminius. In fact, there's good evidence to suggest that all of these temples may have been intended to provide rostra, speakers' platforms, from which assemblies of the Roman people could be addressed. On the subject of these three temples, I'm basing my analysis on an influential book published in 2004 titled Mass Oratory and Political Power in the Late Roman Republic by Robert Morstein Marx, professor of classics at UC Santa Barbara, who I'm delighted to say is here in the audience this afternoon. He and I were actually students together at Berkeley back in, well, a long time ago. The book is about the role of the Contio in Roman politics in the age of Cicero and Caesar particularly. Contiones were political gatherings, informal assemblies where the ordinary citizens of Rome could be addressed by their elected leaders and informed about the most important issues of the day, especially in the run-up to elections or when an important vote on legislation was to take place. As I've already mentioned, in the late Republic, such gatherings were frequently held in the Roman Forum in front of the Temple of Castor. The Temple of Dius Julius was also built in the Roman Forum, almost directly in front of and adjacent to the Temple of Castor, and with a similar rostrum from which the assembled people could be addressed. We repeatedly hear about this temple being used in this way under the Empire. We even have an image on coins of the Emperor Hadrian addressing a crowd from the front of this temple. It became a very important place for formal addresses made to the urban plebs, and it might be argued that it was Augustus's aims for this new temple, his new temple to Dius Julius in the Forum, that caused him to change the plan for Caesar's Forum, to develop that space instead, not as a new comitium, but as a site for more limited site for courts and for a series of administrative buildings in the closed colonnades with which he subsequently surrounded the temple. Robert Morstein Marx's book on the Contio documents that there were two other places besides the Comitium and the Temple of Castor where popular assemblies were regularly held, both of them outside the Pomerium, or religious center of the city. The final Contio, immediately before a meeting of the Comitia Centuriata in its legislative capacity, would be assembled in the Campus Martius, close to the Saepta, where the vote of the people would take place. This was where Marcus Agrippa, the Emperor Augustus's most important general and eventual son-in-law, built his temple to Mars, Venus, and Julius Caesar, the building we know as the Pantheon, although the one we know was later constructed on the site by the Emperor Hadrian. And his Pantheon is was fronted by a wide speaker's platform accessed by two lateral staircases, one on each side. As Andreas Gruner has persuasively argued, this temple with its enormous pronaos is in fact the great temple to Mars that Caesar had intended to build, in alignment with the great altar to the god that stood in the center of the Campus Martius. This was where the lustrations of the Roman army had always been performed, and so where the Roman people in the form of the army were amassed, and they could have, the idea I think here was they could be addressed from the front of this temple. Thus, another space for great gatherings was now furnished with the backdrop of a temple facade dedicated to the other ancestral divinity of the Roman people, Mars, for Mars was said to have been the father of Romulus. The second space outside the Pomerium used for such assemblies was in the area referred to as the Circus Flaminius, and Professor Morstein Marx identifies the space in question as the area in front of the Temple of Bologna, a temple where meetings of the Senate were often held under the Republic. In the early 20s BC, a great new Augustan temple was built right next to the Temple of Bologna, the Temple of Apollo Socianus. You can see the plan and the reconstruction of this temple in these two drawings on the right of this slide. And this temple, too, was seemingly intended to be entered by staircases at the side, and it looks as though it was intended to be fronted by a speaker's platform. It's not restored this way in this reconstruction. It looks very much as if this kind of temple design, seen in all of these early Augustan temples, taken over from the Temple of Castor and prominently used for the Temple of Venus Genotrix, was seen as an honored manifestation, an explicit expression of Caesar's popularis politics, his role as champion of the Roman people. These great temples with speakers' platforms in front of them are surely the ideal accompaniment for Julius Caesar's marble voting booths in the Saepta and his planned Diribitorium, the hall for counting votes, both projects also completed by Marcus Agrippa at more or less the same time in the 20s BC. Together with the Temple of Venus Genotrix and the Temple of Castor, also rebuilt by Augustus soon afterwards and rededicated by his successor Tiberius, these Templa Rostrata, as Roger Ulrichs calls them, represent a monumental refashioning of some of Rome's most important sacred buildings. A refashioning which makes the people's role in politics unmistakably visible. In this dramatic transformation of the city, Sulla's diminution and disenfranchisement of the populus Romanus was now completely reversed and undone. And one might say that these magnificent sacred buildings now embodied in the fabric of the capital the political authority of the popular assemblies. I'd like to conclude this thought experiment with two general observations. First, as I hope to have shown, it matters greatly what assumptions one brings to the archaeological remains of Caesar's Forum. The well-known features of the ensemble mean something quite different if Caesar was intending to rebuild and enlarge the Comitium than if he was planning an entirely separate forum, something close to what was eventually built. Second, just from the few issues that I've discussed this afternoon, it's clear that the great initiative of rebuilding the imperial capital as a means of imposing a new and better political order at Rome begins not with Augustus, but with Caesar. Caesar first acquired the land and started the great transformation of the Roman Forum and the Campus Martius. In the years immediately after his assassination, this endeavor was then taken up not just by Octavian, the later Emperor Augustus, his heir, but collectively by almost all his most important followers. The Caesarian Lucius Munatius Plancus completely rebuilt the Temple of Saturn in the Roman Forum, starting in 42 BC. Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, Caesar's former master of horse, oversaw the construction of the Saepta in the Campus Martius between 44 and 40 BC. Gaius Asinius Pollio rebuilt the Atrium Libertatis with its great library, beginning in 39 BC. Gaius Domitius Calvinus rebuilt the Regia in the Roman Forum after it burned in 36 BC. Gaius Sosius, a Caesarian partisan of Mark Antony, began rebuilding the Temple of Apollo Medicus in the late 30s BC, the temple later known by his name as the Temple of Apollo Socianus. During all these years, Octavian's building efforts primarily centered on completing Caesar's most important projects, Caesar's Forum, the new Senate House, the Curia Julia, and the Chalcidicum, and perhaps most importantly, constructing the new Temple of Divus Julius in the very center of the Forum itself. These buildings were all dedicated together in 29 BC. The conclusion we should draw, even from a bare list, such as the one I've just presented, is clear. The vision that lay behind the Augustan building program was Caesar's. It was he who first conceived of refounding the political order through a massive program of reconstruction. It was he, with the vast wealth he acquired in Gaul, who actually began the process. As the new Danish-Italian excavations get underway in Rome, it is well for us to remember this. If we ask, where did the Augustan building program begin? It began here in Caesar's Forum. Thank you. What's that?
Would you like to take some questions?
Oh, yes. If people have questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Is this working? Thank you for coming in to speak on the subject of the expansion of the Comitium.
Yes.
I had a question about how if we're imagining Caesar's initial plan to possibly be more open, an extension of that corner of the Forum, Caesar also moved the rostra, the original rostra, right, to the side. So how do those two things work together if we're thinking of Caesar as expanding what by his time is kind of a defunct space, right? The Comitium is no longer really the main space for speakers to address the people. They turn around now and
Right.
speak to the main forum.
Right.
With that movement of the rostra, with that movement of the Senate House,
Yeah.
how do all three of those elements, the Caesar's Forum and those two elements, work together in the space?
Well, that's a very difficult question because, I think they were quite happy to have the old Curia Hostilia removed and to put it somewhere else. But people who discuss this normally assume that Caesar was going to put it where Octavian puts it. Mm-hmm. But Octavian sort of puts it into a very clear pattern that is going to shut off the new area from the old Forum. He moves it in such a way that it's quite separate from, it's sort of locked into the colonnades that surround the Forum, which now looks much more like a completely separate unit.
Mm-hmm. Sorry.
I mean, it became, I'm in doing this and in sort of trying to explore what's at stake. I'm not able to do more than sort of suggest that the parameters within which we've been discussing this should be perhaps a bit broader. I think if we're prepared to, if anyone is prepared to take the view which I think is Roger Ulrich's view, that he wasn't going to build a temple to begin with. If they're prepared to take that, then I think a lot of these other things which have been argued about, where was he going to move the rostra, where was the new Senate House going to be, they're very we could be very flexible on those
Right.
too. It may not have been clear, and it's certainly perhaps misleading to just assume that they're intended to be where they ended up. Anyway, I hope that answers.
No, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have any questions they want to pose?
Question about coins.
Uh-huh.
I didn't realize that the coins there must have been thousands.
Yeah.
So did it have value? Like, was it used as money or were they just these?
So, well, the coins that we've been showing here, which coinage isn't being produced in the ancient world for general use, in the way that the mint produces it today. How much money do we need? Let's produce them. It's being produced for big projects. So to pay an army if you're going to war, if you're going to build a new forum, you're going to have to pay a lot of people, and you'll need to pay them with something. And so, coinage is generated by the needs of the state rather than to provide. But it makes it very, the way it was produced makes it a very important source for ancient historians, because as you can see, it was put in the hands, in the late 2nd century BC, it was put in the hands of younger magistrates, people who are starting out on their careers, political careers, and they seem to have had some leeway, some sort of, what should we say, opportunity to select what will be commemorated on the coins, and so they often produce designs which celebrate their family or make some reference to their noble ancestors, this kind of thing. But by the time we get to the sort of coins I'm showing, this is very much a concerted effort to celebrate the big events of the day, and this is true of the civil wars. It's true of all the Caesarian. The followers of Julius Caesar are minting coins that support his cause. The Caesarian party through its money is commemorating things they regard as really important on whatever coins need to be minted in the particular year. So I hope that answers both some of the differences, but also some of the possibilities for us. Yeah.
Could you put in today's terms what the costs were, the original cost you mentioned, and however many 60 million?
Yeah, 60 million sesterces. Yeah. Well, how much would it take to support an enormous modern army in the field for a year? I wonder how much it's costing Russia to invade Ukraine with their army. I suspect it's quite a lot, but I can't tell you. But in terms of equivalents, that's the best thing that the ancient historians have come up with, is to make an equivalent like that. And soldiers were well paid. Soldiers are not the least paid. Oh, sorry.
I'm very intrigued intrigued with this idea of the Temple of Venus Genotrix as the whole compound as a comitium, and I'm wondering, how does that sort of answer to and kind of oppose itself to Pompey's temple of Venus and Pompey's theater?
Well, the only point I was making was that Venus Victrix, it sounds from our historical sources, if they're right, that's who, Venus Victrix was who Caesar was going to honor with a temple, but he changed his mind. And the change of mind is usually taken as a sort of move towards a kind of personal celebration, Caesar as a sort of, in line with the perpetual dictator. That's how it's been often taken, I think. But I don't know that it's been pressed that hard. But all I was wanting to suggest is that, in fact, it could be a step back from a kind of victory temple of an individual Roman commander, and instead, I was wanting to make it. He also had the plan that there was going. He said there should be a giant temple of Mars in the Campus Martius to go with the altar in the middle. And I was just saying, well, this would be the temple of Venus Genotrix, and that would be the temple of Mars, the other,
I think it's just lovely. I'm intrigued with how it sort of rebuts Pompey. Pompey gives the Roman people a theater, sort of bread and circuses, and Caesar's legacy is to give the Roman people a place to exercise their power.
Yeah, a really dignified kind of architectural monumentalization of that power in a way. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to suggest anyway. Yeah.
I think I'm going to release you now because it's been what a wonderful lecture. Thank you so much, and thank you for sharing such original research again with our audiences. We always appreciate that. And thank you so much for your attention. I hope you have a lovely evening, and I'll see you for Jan's lecture hopefully next month. Okay, bye.